One communion Sunday, a new minister decided to talk and ask questions about communion during the children's message. He said, the Bible talks of Holy Communion being a joyful feast. And then he asked, what does that mean? And when none of the children replied, he said, well, joyful means happy, right? And a feast is a meal. So a joyful feast is a happy meal. Can anyone tell me what makes a happy meal for them? And one of the children excitedly raised his hand. Oh, I know. Hamburger fries and a free toy. Today we celebrate communion as a joyful, happy meal here because all are invited and welcome to it, which is also symbolic of this community as it is of the historic Jesus movement, the early church. And today's Bible lesson can be heard to profoundly symbolize the wide open inclusiveness of Jesus' way. That lesson is unsurprisingly often referred to as the story of the Ethiopian Eunuch. And although it's not a story often preached about in church, it does come up in the lectionary every 3 years. And I also actually mentioned it briefly back in January of last year. When we consider this story, it's all right to think that there really was an Ethiopian eunuch who became a church convert early on. But it's also okay to consider it as fictionalized parable. Either way you see, the story was recorded to teach, as Jesus taught, that there are no boundaries, none, to whom may join Jesus' way. And this is not the only Ethiopian eunuch in the Bible who gets saved. In the Old Testament, God tells Jeremiah that an Ethiopian eunuch, Ebed-Melech, is to be saved when the temple falls. Back then it was to Babylon. And it's no coincidence that when our lesson was written, the temple had also recently fallen, this time to Rome. And like Jeremiah, a religious leader, Philip, hears God sending him to save an Ethiopian eunuch. Today's lesson can be heard in a sense of a reenactment of the salvation of a eunuch with the final fall of the temple. And this is amazing, because Old Testament laws prohibit eunuchs from worshiping in community and even giving offerings. Under biblical purity laws, eunuchs could not be Jews. Eunuchs under Torah were shunned from worship, yet in Jeremiah, and in the lesson that we just heard Marilyn read, God claims them for salvation just as they are. Biblical authors and audiences back then would have been familiar with the non-Jewish ancient Near East role of a royal eunuch. Whether real or fictional, the Ethiopian eunuch would have been considered a neutered male, and in the role of eunuch would have acted non-male-like. The eunuch probably didn't have a say in his neutering, but by the start of the story in Acts, he is necessarily self-identifying as a eunuch. Otherwise, no one would know of his eunuchness. He's not acting culturally manlike. That's how Philip, the author, and the readers know he's a eunuch. That's read in, it's implied by his royal station and identification to us as a eunuch. And that's a bit of a long-winded way to say that the Ethiopian eunuch in modern parlance did not gender identify as a man, but rather lived into and accepted a non-man role in his culture. And his eunuchness is used by the author of Acts to illustrate that all barriers to joining the early church were down. Absolutely all of them. Modern ideas on gender identification, as I understand them, assert that human gender identity does not necessarily comport with XX and XY chromosomes that most humans are given at birth. Regardless of chromosome makeup, gender identification has come to mean the gender identity that a person's brain tells them that they are. Most of us born with XY chromosomes eventually gender identify as men in the culture, but not all of us do. Most of us born with XX chromosomes gender identify as women in the culture, but not all of us do. Those are facts. Our brain tells us. We don't choose, and our chromosome lineups alone do not dictate what our gender identity is. And that can be mind-bending to consider because we're raised thinking our chromosomes always dictate the gender roles we identify with. But that's not true. And sadly, Western culture has long thought it was true. And so those that identify outside their gender role have been treated differently. Like in the time Acts was written, to be a eunuch meant to be an outlier because eunuchs did not conform to their apparent birth gender. In the context of our lesson, the Ethiopian eunuch was born male and then was intentionally neutered to alter his expected heterosexual maleness. And he did this in order to make him unable to express or behave like a heterosexual male. This alteration allowed him to be a part of the queen's court without worry about intimate relationship or sexual assault. The alteration of male workers around royal women was a Gentile tradition in the ancient world. And it was also a tradition in the ancient world to demean and condescend, to mock, discriminate, and ostracize eunuchs. Having a non-male gender identification, a eunuch no longer fit the norms expected of his birth gender, and so became the subject of discrimination, including discriminatory laws. And the Bible has such laws. They're still in there. Those ancient laws labeled eunuchs as impure. Deuteronomy provides eunuchs shall not be admitted to the assembly of the Lord. Leviticus prohibits eunuchs from being priests and even approaching God to make an offering. And the reason for these laws is that eunuchs were considered to be impure. They differed from ancient Jewish cultural expectations of males. And you would think that those Old Testament laws and discriminations are out of date, and no one is giving heed to such thoughts in our day and age, but actually, eunuchs can be heard to be like those in our community that we know as transgender. And transgender people are very much belittled and bullied and discriminated against by our culture and our churches and our laws. If you've heard me or others refer to LGBT, the T in that stands for transgender. Although LG and B have to do with sexual orientation, trans does not. The T does not. Transgender is about an individual's gender identity, not their sexual desires. The American Psychological Association defines transgender as, quote, an umbrella term for persons whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex to which they were assigned at birth. Gender identity refers to a person's internal sense of being male, female, or something else. Gender expression refers to the way a person communicates gender identity to others through behavior, clothing, hairstyles, voice, or body characteristics. Trans is sometimes used as a shorthand for transgender. End quote. In the context of our Bible lesson, you can hear that the Ethiopian eunuch's identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to that typically associated with the sex assigned at birth. The Ethiopian eunuch is expressing a non-male identity, gender, and behavior. And in our story, he's reading from Hebrew scripture, Isaiah, when he's stopped by Philip. And given the biblical laws against eunuch, he has every reason to ask Philip what might prevent him from being baptized into the then Jewish sect of the Jesus followers. Philip Philip's unhesitatingly baptizing him answers the question. Nothing is to prevent it. And see, the book of Isaiah that he's reading prophesies that eunuchs would be accepted one day. Isaiah 56 reads, "Do not let the eunuch say, 'I am just a dry tree.' For thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off." And our reading today can be heard as a fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, how cool is that? A eunuch who is very much like what we call a transgender is welcome into the church. We can hear that as a lesson that nothing should prevent transgender folk from being welcomed into church today. Absolutely nothing. In the case of this eunuch, gender identity was created by an unnatural neutery, which is, of course, rare in our culture. But gender identity that does not conform to gender assigned at birth also occurs naturally as a part of God's goodly creation. How? Well, many health experts believe that being transgender isn't caused by any one thing. What makes a person comfortable or uncomfortable with his or her anatomy is unclear. But they believe it's the result of a complex mixture of biology, psychology, and environmental factors, and not simply a matter of choice. The Ethiopian eunuch's non-conformity with XY chromosome expectations got him his job with the queen, so the trans nature of a eunuch was prized in that narrow capacity in the Gentile culture, Ethiopia. But as I said, the trans nature of a eunuch was also the source of discrimination and loathing in parts of both ancient Gentile and Jewish cultures. However, in the book of Acts, the Ethiopian eunuch is pointedly not discriminated against, not loathed. He is treated respectfully and equally, just like the prophecy in the book of Isaiah said he would be. I have long liked the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. It is packed with power and meaning and instruction and soaked to the very core with love. A person whose gender identity is culturally unaccepted and condemned in part of the Bible is sought out and welcomed at the command of God by early church leaders. And notably, it's the first conversion in a line of them in Acts 8, 9, and 10. Before Paul is baptized, before Cornelius, the Roman centurion, is converted to the faith, God first sends Philip to the Ethiopian eunuch to bring him into the fold of the post-Easter church, making it clear that no one is prevented from being baptized by cultural standards of purity. God causes Philip to bring a eunuch into the fold despite Old Testament texts that can be read to literally require eunuchs to be shut out of the faith community. The very same type of text still used today to shun LGBTQ from church communities and to bully them. But you see, those who would shun and bully LGBTQ are choosing to ignore or read away parts of the Bible that pretty clearly instruct that those who don't conform to purity laws are sought out by God to be included equally into Jesus' community. Throughout the New Testament, we can hear Jesus putting aside purity laws over and over again to tend to all manner of unclean people. He touches the untouchables. He tends to the unclean. Jesus always places compassion above outward signs of supposed impurity. So much so he asserts in Mark that there is nothing outside a person that by going in can defile, but the things that come out are what defile. Marcus Borg argued that this is echoed in Matthew when Jesus says, "Blessed are the pure in heart." True purity, Borg points out, is a matter not of external boundaries, but of the heart. Eunuchs were considered sexually defective, and so at the bottom of the purity system. So our reading today is a radical story, which by no stretch of the imagination has God sending no less than an apostle out to affirmatively find, run alongside, teach, baptize, and bring into Christ's community as an equal someone whom Bible purity laws discriminate against. Godly made, goodly, transgender-like neighbor is welcome and honored and loved. Today's lectionary text strongly evidences that the early church rejected out of hand the unloving, reject such folks' purity model. It instead embraced Jesus' compassion rules, his love always wins model. It's right there. It's right there in black and white in the book of the Acts of the Apostles. Before Paul, a loathed persecutor of the faith, is converted in Acts 9. Before Cornelius, an enemy Roman soldier, is converted in Acts 10. The Ethiopian eunuch, a shun, transgender-like person, is converted in Acts 8. That's one of the best kept secrets in the Bible. Jesus brought everyone into his fold and taught his followers to do that. And this story shows his early followers coming through and doing that, daring to knock down all barriers to community and love. And just after the Ethiopian eunuch and Paul and Cornelius are converted, Peter wrestles with some sort of purported rule about Jews visiting Gentiles. As Peter wrestled, God issued one of my all-time favorite divine edicts. God commanded that we should not call anyone profane or unclean. That's a quote. We should not call anyone profane or unclean. And then note there's no wiggle room in that command. It is literally applicable to anyone a Christian might want to call profane or unclean. That command is we should not do it. And when Christians do it, we violate God's command. Here's the good news. Often hidden news that's in the text we've considered this morning. The early church heard and recorded God's call for the biblical ban of eunuchs, of trans-like folks, to be ignored, to be superseded by Christ's teaching and supreme command to love our neighbors. The early church heard and it recorded God's call for eunuchs, for trans-like folk to be sought out, baptized, loved, and welcomed fully into the community. The early church heard and recorded God's command to not call anyone profane or unclean. And anyone includes, of course, the entire spectrum of LGBTQ. And in the context of Acts 8 to 10, that command expressly applies to our trans neighbors. Now, this will surprise you. Not every church or pastor is going to tell you this stuff. Many churches will not even read aloud or preach on today's lesson. In fact, no doubt this week some Christians will wrongly and quite unlovingly label our transgender brothers, sisters, and neighbors as biblically impure or profane. The early church didn't agree with such labels or shunning or mistreatment. It's not loving of neighbor. It does not do to others as we want done to us, nor does it comply with God's crystal clear command to not call anyone profane or unclean. The early church took its cue from Jesus and God and knocked down hurdles to love by including and providing compassion to a eunuch, someone we could fairly call today transgender. Treated a transgender-like image of God as a goodly part of creation, as welcome and loved by Jesus and his community. And here at First Congregational United Church in Christ, we take our cue from Jesus and God and the Bible and the early church, and we consider the many beautiful human images of God as equals, including, of course, our godly created and made transgender brothers and sisters and neighbors. Our answer to the Ethiopian eunuch's question, what's to prevent folks like him from being baptized, is the same as God, Philip, and the early church's answer.